Hello friend, welcome back. In our previous video, I have already discussed about that things with you, how can display your all that list data with using that list view class, right? So now all the data actually comes from our database table and now it's visible on here. So now I want to work for our details view. That means here if you click as a Aryan, then it should be redirected to our another page with the view details. So for doing this, first of all, we have to work in our view into the view area. We have to load one of the building class. So they have also one of the building class as a detail view. So here, first of all, you have to load this class. So now with this detail view, we can actually do that work very easily. It should be very much clear to you right now. Like here, first of all, I define one of the class. And here I name it as a musician detail. Okay, musician detail, this type of one of the class I have defined, and it should be inherited with our this details view. That means this detail view class, it should be inherited. Okay, and then it should be the same concept. It should be as a context object name, and with the context object name, whatever the data name you want to pass it on here. Like here I name it as a musician. Okay, I just name it as a musician, and then the model. And now friend, I hope step by step everything will be very much clear to you. You can see that's actually the same concept. So now I have to define that model, and then we have to define that our model name. So our model name, I want to get that things from our musician. So that is our musician table. And after that also we have to define our template. That means our template name. Into the template name area, we have to load one of the template, right? So I have to create one of the template in our fast. Into our fast tab, into the fast tab area, I want to create one of the template name as a musician details, musician underscore details .html. Okay friends, so I just simply defining it. So now we have to create it. So now we have to create our this musician details .html in our fast tab. So here I just click as a new file and I just name it as a musician details .html. So first of all, here we have to load our extended everything. Like here we have to extended our everything. I just simply defining it, and also we have to end our this block. So after this, I just simply define that block. And also here we have to put some of the link in our index, right? So into the index HTML, here I want to take one of the ahref, and I want to finish that ahref. So here I just simply end it. If you now click as a save all, if you now refresh it, yeah, you can see it's now putting that link. So I want to do, if you click on here, that means if you click in particular that the musician, it should be redirected to our this musician details with all the data. So they have also one of the specific data is you can see there is a first name, the last name, and the installment. But here we have to defining it with a specific one of the ID, right? Like here you can see that is ID one data I have to get, and there is also another ID as a 6 ID data. So I want to get all that 6 ID data details and 7 ID data details. So here we have to also pass one of the ID, right? So we have to get all that our details data with the specific ID. So first of all, I want to create one of the URL. So now go to our URL, that means fast application, that is our URL. So now I just simply copy it. Now I want to create another path, and first of all I want to define one of the URL name as a musician underscore details. Okay, I just name it as a musician underscore details, and then also here we have to pass some of the ID. So I will do that things later. Then it's actually our view. Into the view I have already created one of the class, our class name as a musician details. So I just simply copy it, and now go to our URL, and that will be as our musician details as view, and then name it as a musician details. I just name it as a musician details. So now we have to add our this path in our index. That means here I have to pass it. So as I told you, we have to also get all that our data, that means details data with a specific one of the ID. Like there is actually one of the ID, there is another ID, there is another ID, right? So we have to get it with a specific one of the ID. So I want to put that link in our index. So here, if you put that your URL, I think you already know about it. So here you have to pass your URL key, and then in our fast tab, that means our application name. So I have defined that our application name as a fast tab. So with this fast tab, I want to access our which name. I want to access our this path name, that is our musician details. So I just simply define that musician details, right friend? And also after that we have to define one of the IDs. So here I want to define one of the, that means this ID I want to access. So if you want to access it with this ID, you can define that things with the name as the ID, rather than if you define as a default as a PK, that means the primary key, then automatically it should be getting this ID. Okay, so I just take that things, name it as a PK, and with this PK I have already get all the data with this musician list with the musician. So with this musician I want to access our this ID. Okay, so here with this musician, if you define that as a ID, then you can defining it, then it should be as a specific, rather than if you default make the things as a default as a PK, that means that automatically it should be getting our primary key. Okay, so for the reasons here I have defined that primary key means actually our this ID, right? So I just simply defining it. So now we have to also define that our this PK in our URL. So now go to our URL, into the URL area after this. So before we use that init, so right now we don't need to use anything here. You have to only define that PK. Okay, so here only you have to defining it. So if you use that class, then you don't need to use that init before we actually use that init and then our PK, right? So then before we have use it, so right now we don't need this. You have to simply define that PK, that means the primary key ID. So here you have to pass it. So now we have to visible this data, right? So into the view area, I have already defined that our context object, all that name with this musician. So with this musician, now we can actually access our all the data in our, that means a specific ID data, because here I have already defined our specific ID. So here now I want to use it in our musician details. So now go to our musician details, in particular that page area, I want to display it. So first of all, I simply define as a S3, and into the S3 I just simply name it as a musician details. Okay, I just name it as a musician details. So now here I want to visible that things with the paragraph better. Into the paragraph, first of all, with this musician, that means with this musician I want to display all that our database field name. So our, first of all, our database field name as a first name, last name, and the instrument. So I just simply define as a first name. Okay, first name, and also I take another one, and here with this musician I want to display our last name, and also after this I take another paragraph, and here I want to display our musician instrument. So with this musician I want to display our database field name as the instrument, right? So I just simply define as the instrument. So make that sure your spelling is correct. So that is actually instrument. Perfect. So friend, that's all you have to do. I hope you can well understand about that process. So here I have created one of the class as our musician details, and here it would be inherited with our one of the in building class, that is our details view class. And here I have defined our context name. I just get all that our specific ID data and take the things with this musician, and then I define our model, right? And also I define our template area. So into the template area it should be load this data. So that is our musician details area. I have simply defined our musician first name, musician last name, and musician instrument. And also in our URL, so into the URL I have passed it. So I have passed it our musician with our specific ID data. That means it should be redirected to our specific one of the ID. And here I define our class name as view, our name I have defined as a musician details. So for the reasons in our index page, into the index page I have defined some of the URLs. So I have defined that URL key as a first tab. With this first tab I used our URL name, that means the path name, as a musician details. And then with this PK I define our musician. So with this musician I access our ID. That ID by default, that is actually the primary key. So I just simply define that name as a PK. Okay, so that's all you have to do. Now let's check this out. If you now click as a save all, now first of all I want to check it, everything is running well. Now go here, refresh this page, now click as a Kazarian. Yes, now you can see friend, now it's actually redirected to our musician details with a specific ID, right? So that is actually our requested ID. So that is our Kazarian is visible, and also the guitar is visible. That means the instrument feed data is visible. And if you go to the home, go to the Taylor Swift, that is ID as a 6, and only is now visible our specific this 6 ID data. Go to the home, go to our another 7, so that is our 7 ID data, so that is the musician details, and that is our the first name, last name, and also that is the instrument. Perfect. And also here, if you want to load all that our this specific user, that means this specific musician, all that album, then you can also display it. How much easily you can display it, I will show you. Like here right now, if you go to our model, that means in our FastApp, into the FastApp, if you go to that our FastApp model area, I have already defined one of the artists. Here I call it with the foreign key, right? So here I have already defined one of the foreign key with our this musician table. So now if you want to get a specific this all that our that is the musician album data, then you can also defining it. Then you have to add another related name. So here you have to define that related underscore name, and into this related name here you have to pass the value. So here I just simply pass that value name as a album list. Okay, I just name it as a album list. So with this album list, now we can actually visible our this related name all the data. So now if you want to visible it, go to our musician details. So that is our musician details. So after this, okay, after this I want to take one of the S3 tag, and here I name it as an album. Okay, I just name it as an album, and then I define one of the UL, because here I also want to load all that our musician album, that means a specific this musician album, right? And into the UL area, first of all, here we have to load one of the for loop. So I just simply define that for loop as a for, and I name it as an album. Okay, and then I have already get all the data. I have already get all the data with this musician, right? So now with this musician, I want to access our another related name. That is the related name I have defined in our model area. So that is a related name. I have defined that as an album list. So now with this album list, I want to get all that our album data. So now if you want to get all the data, you have to define that album list. That means here you have to define this album list and album list all data. So I just simply define as all data. So now with this, it should be getting a specific this musician all that album data. So now after this, we have to AND it. That means the AND for. So I just simply define as AND for. Okay, and now in particular that area I want to visible it. So I just simply define as LI, and then I just take our this musician album list all the data and make the things with this album. So now with this album we can actually display it, right? So with this album I want to display our database field name. If you go to our album, into the album here I can say I define that name. So I want to only get our specific all that name. So that is our field name as a name. So I just simply want to access our this name. Okay friend, so that's all you have to do. Now let's check this out. If you now click as a save all, I just click as a save all. Now go here, refresh this page. Better I just go to the home, refresh it, go to the Kazarian. Yes, you can see friend, this Kazarian have only one album, so that is the album is visible. And also if you go to the Taylor Swift, so for the Taylor Swift they have no album, and if you go to that ABB, yeah, you can see there is actually another album is added, so that is actually the album perfectly visible. I hope you can well understand about it, how can display your all the details with using that our details view model. So with this we can actually perfectly display it. So in our next video I want to create this data. So previously we have created it with using that function. Now we want to create it with using that class. So how can do that work? In our next video I will show you that things with the live example. So thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next video.